To today's presentation. We are about to begin. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Metz, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast titled Go Beyond Annual Reviews with the new ISO Experience Index. This event is brought to you by Property Casualty 360 and sponsored by Verisk. Before we begin, let's go over some basic housekeeping items about the webcast console. This event is completely interactive and features many customizable functions. Every window you currently see, from the speaker window to the slides to the Q&A panel, can either be enlarged or collapsed. So if you'd like to change the look and feel of your console, go right ahead. If you have a question for our speaker, please enter it in the Q&A panel on your console for the live Q&A at the end. We'll ask as many questions as possible, so please ask away. And if we don't get to your question, we do send these to our speaker after the event, so you may receive an email response afterwards. Lastly, Verisk has made some resources available, so take a moment to download them so you can review them at your leisure. Now, let's get to today's topic and why you all are here. In 2023, the insurance industry exceeded loss ratio levels that have not been seen in nearly 20 years. As loss levels accelerate, it becomes even more critical to find responsive data to identify where most attention is needed and deploy effective rate management strategies. So, insurance professionals should be asking, is there room to sense these trends faster and adjust more efficiently? Here with us to go over this is Ralph Dweck, Director of Actuarial Transformation at Verisk. Dweck is an actuarial leader with over a decade of experience at Verisk. He is responsible for transforming Verisk's actuarial content, including the development of a new thought leadership and decision-making tools. He has held several roles prior, most notably overseeing Verisk's Risk Analyzer predictive rating enhancements for commercial lines. Ralph is a fellow of the Casualty Actuarial Society and a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. Ralph, it's great to have you, and I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate everyone for joining today. I think as Jeff sort of alluded to in the overview there, we as an industry often face a problem or a conflict in the way that we manage and work through our rate change strategy. In that, I think the primary mechanism that we rely on for this sort of power, this sort of oversight over our own businesses is through filed rates, filed loss costs, if we're talking in the ISO Verisk loss cost world. But with that, I think the loss cost and rate filing process has many positives in it. As an actuary, I'm very proud of the very many actuarial enhancements that we've developed, that we use, that we put into play in order to arrive at loss costs that are appropriate and help keep the insurance industry healthy, and sort of figure out the appropriate amount to set rates at. But it comes with some challenges as well, in that it takes time and effort and a lot of work to apply all these sort of adjustments. And then even once you have your calculated prospective rate insight based on the data that has come in recently, you still have to then go through the regulatory and filing process, which has its own latency built in, where the amount of time between when a rate can become effective from the time you're actually seeing some sort of pattern in your data can be quite a bit of a lag. And so, obviously, built into all of that then comes that when you are performing rate calculations, rate updates, revisions, let's say, in a hypothetical year, if in a particular state you're making that update in December, you probably won't be apt to make another update in that same state for a little bit of time, most commonly just the following December. These things tend to find their cyclicality, and you sort of build a program that you can use to update everything that sort of fits in and has certain milestones and can kind of be pretty standardized as you move forward into the future. Of course, that creates a whole span of time where what else is everybody doing? Everyone's not just sitting on their hands waiting for the following loss cost update to happen. And certainly it's probably not just enough to kind of just run through the motions over and over again of, well, we just push the button and out comes the new rates and we just keep that on cycle, because business pressures often pop up far sooner than that. We find things emerging in data that we recognize as issues or actionable items, but we may not be able to fully reflect them in a filed loss cost product for some amount of time that is understood and known in advance. But that doesn't necessarily preclude us from developing other action plans and strategies around them. And furthermore, even though we have kind of a set schedule of the way that we look at things as an industry, if we learn new information, we probably should be pivoting our schedules and strategies and just our plans around turning what we're seeing in data into actions and insights. So that whole white span here of what's happening the rest of the year is certainly vacant, and it's vacant for insurers and our staff at ISO and Verisk as well to kind of look at the data and reflect upon it. And from an insurer standpoint, certainly there are things other than filed rate action that can happen, underwriting strategies and portfolio management, things like that we hear are regularly happening, even though the data that's coming in is not immediately being reflected in loss costs. But certainly finding that data, being able to leverage perhaps the data that will ultimately be reflected in the loss costs in advance is certainly a kind of ongoing problem, particularly where insurers only have so much data that's coming in so quickly. So that sort of set the stage for why we've developed this new tool, the ISO Experience Index, based on that feedback that we've heard quite a bit from carriers. Right? There's this need to tap into that data source, but to be able to do it more quickly, maybe not with as much importance on all of the nuanced actuarial adjustments that take place in a full-blown rate filing, but even just some subset of that, some approximation of keeping tabs with where the pressures that will drive those loss costs are going, to tap into that and then to be able to see that with relatively minimal latency from when the data actually happens versus when the data can be viewed versus when that data will be turned into action. And then hopefully that kind of bridges that gap between what's happening on cycle in those loss cost reviews versus what can happen at more intermediate time periods, all that white space on the previous slide. And so that's exactly what we've been able to deploy with this ISO Experience Index, this new tool that we have available at core.verisk.com. Ultimately, with this product, you can access quarterly data updates, which provide a sense of where the pure premium, right, the loss per exposure, has been going up until the most recent quarterly point, and get a sense for where those pressures are changing much more rapidly than you might get if you wait for a loss cost update to come around on cycle. And so, through this, we hope that this can kind of accelerate pricing decisions, add more confidence into the kind of other action that can take place in between getting an actual filing out the door, whether it's planning and strategizing, resource allocation, or taking other non-filing actions that might help with management of loss cost pressures and rate inadequacies and things like that. So a little bit more about the tool and kind of what it looks like and how it all works. Each point that's presented in the tool, in the dashboard tool, quantifies the pure premium for trailing 4 quarters. The values are converted into an index. So, in the way that many people are often familiar with, like the consumer price index, a CPI, it's baseline to some point in the past. So everything is being compared to that point in the past. And so for this particular tool, we set the baseline pegging point as 2013 fourth quarter. Nothing too radically special about that quarter, just something we chose, decently far in the past. And then, users can then view the quarterly data points from that point onward and track how pure premium has changed in those time periods. You can filter by state. You can create subsets of states. You can modify the visual window of time that's visible in the dashboard to make it a little bit easier to see things. And so, using the example we have presented here in this slide, this is the Connecticut data from the ISO Experience Index for homeowners, looking at, past several quarters going back in time and up until 2024 first quarter. Each data point is a trailing 4 quarters, so it's a rolling 4-quarter average that is quantified through these index points. And so, for example, we see that 2024 first quarter data point is 178, which means that per exposure, the loss levels in the year ended 2024 first quarter are about 78% higher than what they were at that basis point in 2013 fourth quarter. And so once we understand that this is what's being communicated, the pure premium is what's being captured here, you can then sort of start to follow the patterns as to how pure premium pressures have been changing in Connecticut over time. And so, for example, we see that it was on a pretty steady rise for about 5 quarters there, up until it reached its peak in 2023 third quarter. But since that time, we've actually seen it kind of stabilize or even level off a little bit. It's now down 9.6% from where it reached that peak in that 2023 third quarter. And this is now 2 consecutive quarters where that pure premium pressure has sort of either leveled off or gone down a little bit. And so, this sort of illustrates the intrigue and importance of having a regularly updated set of data with a pretty minimal lag between when the data is occurring versus when it's being reflected in the data product itself. Because if you were kind of following these trends just a few quarters ago, even earlier this year, you might have been wondering if Connecticut is still on this sort of upward climb where loss cost pressures are pushing upward and upward and upward, with this sort of understanding that it might be a center for where you should be putting a lot of resource into research and also filing action, maybe potentially prioritizing Connecticut over other states. But now seeing that it's sort of stabilized at least a little bit and has gone down since that time, it might lead you to make alternative plans and potentially focus on other states and potentially kind of leave Connecticut either in the monitor phase or kind of, either deprioritize it. I often think about like stock portfolios, how analysts often give their buy, their hold, or their sell recommendations. Theoretically, that can be done with every single state. Is it in a hold? Is it in a buy? Is it in a sell? Of course, replace buy, sell, and hold with immediate need for action, moderate need for action, or minimally indicated need for action. These are the kinds of decisions that could really use as much data as possible in order to instill confidence. And certainly, we think this might be one way to get a little bit more confidence. Just to give a sense of that minimal lag, right now the index is updated through 2024 first quarter. By November, we expect to have the data updated through second quarter 2024. And honestly, that's a pretty conservative estimate. I think we might even have it sooner than that. So it really, we're not yet in real time reflection of what's happening versus being able to see it on our computer screens, but we're getting a lot closer than we might have otherwise gotten when relying on more kind of static reports and things like loss cost filings. To give another example, just to zoom out from Connecticut and then look at it in the context of countrywide homeowners trends, we tend to see a lot of the same pattern. There was certainly that rise over some recent quarters. However, the plateau was reached sooner in the countrywide composite index versus what is seen in the Connecticut specific index. And so you can see that it kind of leveled off and plateaued at that 201, 203 range. And then for 3 consecutive quarters at this point, it's been pretty flat after having dropped from that peak that occurred 1 quarter sooner countrywide than it did otherwise in Connecticut. And so, it's sort of, it tells a story that's interesting. Earlier this year, we've heard a lot of, consternation in the homeowners market. Pressures were pushing upward quite a bit. And it seems like there's been at least a little bit of reprieve in the latest emerging data. Obviously that doesn't necessarily preclude things from pushing back upwards as we go forward, but at least it's kind of gives the loss cost filing, the rate filing process a little bit of room to breathe to kind of catch up to its own latencies, so that you're not forever on that treadmill of chasing additional rate hikes while the data keeps pushing upward faster than potentially filed rating products can catch up. So certainly interesting mechanics that become visible. And, obviously we looked at Connecticut specifically, we looked at countrywide, but the tool really lends itself to looking at individual states. You can create state groups, regional groups. You can kind of put it all together, and certainly that's all potentially useful depending on the scope of states and the way that things are grouped from a portfolio level can be very helpful to kind of make those different groupings. I alluded a little bit in terms of the use cases that we hear from carriers in terms of how this can help them, but yeah, identify markets that really require more resource allocation. Assess what the kind of current level is of emerging data versus things that have been filed. If you have a pending rate filing, how is that differing from what your understanding was of the rate adequacy at the time you created that rate filing versus what has changed since that time? Certainly could be potentially helpful. Benchmarking your own results versus the ISO multi-carrier data. Certainly that's always something that's very beneficial. Obviously, we're putting together data from many carriers, so you'll get a lot more kind of stability and confidence in, if you're seeing something that's unusual, is it an emerging pattern? Are you just sort of an outlier? Is the whole are more carriers in the industry showing data that's pushing that same direction? Certainly a very useful piece of information to have. And above all else, I think it accelerates action. Having that confidence allows you to act faster, allows you to be more proactive in what you're doing, and kind of gives you a little bit more of the ability to deviate from very standard cycles that are just coming around because they're scheduled to come around, and actually do things that are kind of more responsive to what you're actually seeing in data. In terms of our roadmap for this product, so we've launched it for homeowners. It's been live for just a while over the course of this year. In terms of expansion to other lines of business, that's certainly our next step. Throughout the rest of this year, we plan to expand the offering of this tool for personal auto as well as for commercial auto. So we expect to see both of those before the end of the year. Personal auto probably coming about a month before the commercial auto tool. In 2025, we also then plan to launch the other major lines of business owners, general liability, commercial property. We also plan to expand the features beyond the basics of what we have launched now into potentially other areas. For example, being able to filter on certain granularities, whether it be using homeowners as an example, potentially being able to drill into different homeowners forms. Whether it's to distill that pure premium information as well as into frequency and severity details, or perhaps potentially peril details, certainly interesting. And certainly as we expand those other lines of business, the levels of granularity and the types of metrics that we're capturing via the various indices will definitely be domain specific to the lines of business. In commercial auto, for example, the ability to separate impacts by liability versus collision versus comprehensive could certainly be something that we're toying with now in terms of how we're going to deploy on that, as well as potentially even distinguishing between, let's say, trucks, tractors, and trailers versus private passenger types. Those sort of commercial auto-centric questions are things we will answer in the user interface for commercial auto in a way that makes it conducive to the way that commercial auto insurers, for example, are managing their own books of business. To talk a little bit more about the methodology, I sort of mentioned at the top, this is not quite the level of degree of actuarial analysis that might go into a full-blown rate filing, but is sort of meant to be a light version of those kinds of analyses. And so, obviously those sort of things take time. That's part of the reason why, you can't just pump out a new rate filing every minute of every day. But we are making some adjustments, if not all of the adjustments. There's probably less use of credibility. There's more focus on what's actually occurred, so the empirical results, and less so on what does that look like after you've applied trend or adjustments like that. And of course, there are also fewer limitations in the context of a rate filing. The actual observations might be a little distorted by, if pressures were pushing up dramatically, but we all know that a regulator in a certain state might not approve an increase of rates above some percentage level. Well, then the actual loss cost change might be capped at some level, or individual territorial changes might be capped in certain ways. There's less attention paid to those sort of limitations because those limitations don't exist. Ultimately, the results of this index are not necessarily being filed. And so it's really meant to be more of a gauge on what's actually occurring in the data, to then set up what the action plan might be, as opposed to kind of forming that dual role of telling you what's happened as well as trying to solve it with action all at the same time. So certainly, decoupling that methodology just a little bit is very helpful in terms of being able to deliver on this data a little bit faster. A couple of the other features that currently exist in the current homeowners tool, I think I mentioned this, but certainly it can be filtered by individual states. You can create custom state groups on the fly, control click, select a bunch of different states that are relevant and create a composite index that reflects the pressure of pure premium for that group of states. Before we were working with an example that showed the trailing 4 quarters average so that each data point communicated the rolling 4 quarters of results. The tool also displays rolling 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years. So, let's say it's a state with less volume, or just, you want to kind of get a more of a long-term picture of how things are changing. You can toggle on those 2 years, 3 years, and 5 year graphs, and even kind of compare them side by side to get a sense for just how dramatically things are changing, how sustained those pressures are. Was this a couple of bad quarters, or is this just a forever rising curve, things along those lines. And finally, an interesting feature that's definitely very helpful for property lines and homeowners, especially an optional toggle that allows a smoothing of the data for quarterly spikes that are coming typically from catastrophes, which then kind of applies an actuarial excess procedure that spreads that impact over surrounding quarters. So, if there's a particular state that encountered a bad storm or a bad event that really just skyrocketed the pure premium for some time, it can be very useful to see that, and certainly you can see that in the product. But from a practical perspective, from a going forward perspective, it may also be helpful to see, if that's a very hyper unusual event, what the data might look like if you sort of tempered the impact of that one event. Are you still seeing things rising, or is it just that one-time spike? Being able to kind of toggle back and forth between those views was something that we heard was important, and so we built that into the tool. And a perfect example for that is California. Here I have the California index of 1 year. Right, these are still rolling 4 quarter points. Each data point represents the trailing 4 quarters. The dark blue line represents the toggled smoothing turned on, and the teal dotted line is with the smoothing turned off. And this is going back now from 2013 all the way through 2024 first quarter. And you can see in the unsmoothed version, right around the time that wildfires were making the news, the pure premium pressure just spiked dramatically and instantaneously, pushing that index sky high. But then almost immediately, and there were a couple of years of those wildfires, some bigger than others. But then after a couple of years, there was a little bit of a lull where wildfires, at least major wildfires, were not occurring for a little while. And then all of a sudden, you see that index value then again plummet, which is useful information. It's very, very helpful to see that. But at the same time, from a going forward perspective, if you were to try and plan what you would do in response, it might also be helpful to track how these things look if you kind of even them out, smooth them out a little bit, temper them, so that it's not just the one, let's say a 1 in 5 year event is not just causing a spike in the data once every 5 years, but sort of smoothing it out a little bit. And that's what we see here with the dark blue line with the toggled smoothing turned on. And so that, again, an interesting pattern to be found there. Also notable, given obviously California's market for homeowners has been in the news quite a bit. A lot of the carriers have pulled out of the market, and the excess market has certainly grown quite a bit in California as well. But in the data that we see, it has stabilized quite a bit over time. Again, it might be some room for some filed rates to at least catch up with the pressures in a way that they might not have had an opportunity in the past. So yeah, certainly interesting results there in California. And with that, I think this tool is one of a few things that we're hoping to deliver to kind of fill out that white space throughout the year. So, just because there are loss costs, which are, obviously what ISO is certainly known for quite a bit as its most dominant actuarial product. There are certainly a lot of other things that we're trying to deliver through more intermediate time periods in between when those loss costs come around on cycle. And so, the experience index is certainly one of them to deliver more just of that understanding of the empirical data. But beyond that, they're also kind of just more synthesizing of taking that empirical data, turning it into actual thought and analysis and kind of putting it all together. And we definitely have a lot of other tools that we've launched in the past year that help deliver on this goal. And so, I would definitely encourage everyone to check some of those out. They're also available on that same core.verus.com website. And here I have listed, for example, the Executive Insights Report, which is a twice a year line of business level report, maybe call it 15 to 20 slides overviewing a line of business and looking at the emerging data in that line of business, whether it's something like loss ratio, frequency and severity patterns, regional patterns, if it's a property line, something like reconstruction cost patterns, just a way to get a good sense for, keep me up to date at a very high level, what's the latest in a particular line of business. And so we've launched those reports and we've gotten some really good feedback. And then we have a monthly report called In the Spotlight, which takes a particular topic kind of at that same level, sort of taking, let's say, a slide from that Executive Insights and blowing it up into something even more granular, looking for some angle of, an emerging piece of data that we've seen in a particular line of business and kind of digging a little bit deeper and hopefully reflecting on what that means. I can think of a perfect example is we often get questions about roof type in homeowners and the way that the different roof types can withstand hail damage, particularly as construction patterns may dictate in the future that different kinds of roofing or potentially regionally different kinds of roofing may become more in vogue. What sort of impact is this having on results if hailstorms become more severe or more common and whatnot? And so that's an example of a question that we then put in the spotlight and dug into a few pieces of data to kind of demonstrate what the numerical impact is of this particular problem as we see it in our data. And so that's another piece of content that we've gotten a lot of good feedback on. So all these are available on core.verus.com. The easiest way to find a lot of these things are on the actuarial hub on core.verus.com. So if you navigate towards that, you can find the new ISO Experience Index tool that we discussed today, as well as another loss cost activity dashboard, which is very useful for tracking the actual filed loss cost activity, as well as many different articles, including those in the Spotlight and Executive Insights. You can also find various one-off articles written about various topics. We did a deductible analysis for commercial property. We wrote about that. We analyzed some severe convective storm issues. We wrote about that. We looked at loss ratios in a particular subcategory for BOP. We looked at claim emergence patterns post-COVID for general liability, and certainly lots of other things that we've done as well. So definitely encourage interested people to check out our actuarial hub on core.verus.com. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jeff. I think we have some time for questions.
Yep. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you. And as a reminder, if you do have a question for Ralph, please go ahead and enter it in the Q&A panel on your console. If we do not get to your question during this live Q&A, we do send these over to him afterwards. You may receive an email response after the event. So the first question I have, how does this differ from other industry reports and ISO products? For example, Fast Track.
That's a great question. And I think Fast Track is definitely a good example of something to start with in terms of comparing and contrasting. And so, I think very much like Fast Track, the product does aim to be one of the earliest indicators of where the data is headed. I think a key difference between this and Fast Track is Fast Track is always focused on calendar kind of accounting results, calendar quarter data, calendar year data. Whereas this, we're focusing more on the accident year data. So you're getting a better sense for the results from a particular quarter, the things that happened in that particular quarter, the impact that they're potentially having on your ability to maintain rate adequacy and whatnot. And so I think that's certainly a big difference. Just the ability to go more granular and make more adjustments. That's something that we have here. As you know, we saw that with the severe quarter adjustment, the smoothing adjustment is something that you wouldn't necessarily get quite to that degree in fast track. And then the ability to even go more granular, as we sort of alluded to, you know, break things out. I mentioned, for example, commercial auto. As time goes on, once that's available, they'll probably have more granularity than you might see, for example, in the commercial auto fast track. In terms of other ISO products, certainly I would always encourage everyone to think of the problem they're trying to solve, and that would sort of indicate which tool is right for that problem. With this, I think we're very much focused on getting data out quickly and kind of getting the first insight into where things are trending. That doesn't necessarily preclude other products from stepping in. You know, I often get a question, what if I wanted to just use like the ISO data cube? The ISO data cube is, for my money, the most powerful tool to see the full scope of the data that we often have access to as internally at our company at Verisk ISO. If insurers want to get access to that same kind of multi-carrier aggregate data from a lot of the industry, the data cube is often the way that they do that. And certainly that remains true, even as we create new products like this one. Certainly, the data cube might take a little bit longer to give you the insight, let's say for 2024 first quarter, than you might get from this. But when it does come around, it'll then allow you to dive deeper. So it's sort of a multi-phased use case where, you know, at first you might be paying attention to what's coming out in this tool. But then as you want to dive deeper and deeper, as the other tools get updated with more refresh data, you'll be able to dissect them even further, which then it ultimately culminates in a filed loss cost, which is, you know, probably the most fully baked of the answers comparatively. So I always see it as a spectrum.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. Thanks. And we are getting a few questions in now. I just want to remind everybody that if you do have a question for Ralph, go ahead and enter it in the Q&A panel. Here's an audience question. The next one, is the Actuarial Hub a software used for decision making?
Good question. Right now, I would say the Actuarial Hub is a portal through which you can access a lot of useful information, all compiled into one easy to find spot. I think historically, ISO customers certainly probably familiar with our ISOnet delivery of many of our products. But the ISOnet delivery is it's a very transactional experience. You have to know which product you're going to look for, and you're ultimately just looking to click a link. The Actuarial Hub is a much more curated place where you can find the various tools as well as insights that previously had no home. You might be getting insights that previously you'd have to just happen to have a conversation with us or be at one of our conferences or whatnot, or see one of our speakers. And so, at this time, we don't necessarily see a lot of decision-making tools yet being launched on the Actuarial Hub, but we do plan to launch new tools as time goes on. Just to kind of allude to a few of them, we've historically had it, for example, what we call AS, Actuarial Service, or ASDI, Actuarial Strategic Data Insights. It's the same product that had a name change over time. But those AS circulars where we release a bunch of different data sets that carriers find useful, most notably trend information, which is the most popular of those reports. We are envisioning a kind of new experience, a new web-based platform where a lot of that trend information will be delivered in a way that's much more interactive. So you're not just looking at static Excel exhibits, but rather you're kind of clicking and playing with certain fits to the observed trend to kind of select trend impacts and trend percentages, as well as kind of quickly get a compilation of what we've seen from trend. If we've used various trend effects in our own rate filings, our own loss cost filings, I should say, being able to see that in one place as opposed to having to go to 50 individual state circulars to look at what we filed, is another thing that we're envisioning for that trend hub. So today it's right now a place where we've curated a few useful tools and insights. But as time goes on, as we reimagine the workflows that are built around the data that we provide to the market, we expect new tools to also be launched on core.verus.com on the Actuarial Hub, and we expect those tools to be pretty interactive.
Great. So the next question I have, how do companies get access to this, and is there a cost?
Great question. So definitely access core.verus.com, Actuarial Hub, it should be right there, the ISO Experience Index. From a cost and licensing, there actually is no additional license or cost for this tool. It's included as part of a loss cost subscription. So carriers who are using the ISO loss costs automatically get this. This is kind of a way that we're trying to augment the value of our loss cost product and kind of shed more light on it contextually. And so it'll be tied to the line of business. So if you get our commercial auto loss costs when we launch commercial auto, you should be accessing the commercial auto ISO Experience Index. And today, homeowners users can certainly access the homeowners ISO Experience Index.
Okay, great. And let's see, another question here. I think you kind of touched on it, but are there plans to add new features or just new lines of business?
Yeah, absolutely. It's both, right? The new lines of business are pretty imminent, so that's very tangible at our fingertips. The new features, a little bit more open-ended right now in terms of that. We absolutely have the appetite to do so. I think the thing we want most is the feedback on what our customers want to see in the product. So that's another thing. We definitely encourage users to reach out, play around with it. If there's something, I think, for example, we've heard in the homeowners right now, we're displaying the pure premium. It's loss per exposure. The exposure is house years. So inherently, inflation is going to increase the pure premium over time. Even if there's no marginal risk increase relative to inflation, if it's just pure inflation, you'd still see those pure premiums go up because the loss per exposure, the loss side is going to be inflation sensitive, but the exposure is not. It's just house years for the most part. So we've heard calls, for example, it might be useful if you also had an inflation sensitive, like an amount of insurance exposure alternative view. And that's certainly something we've considered as well, in addition to the other things I mentioned, like frequency and severity or by peril results and whatnot. So again, certainly encourage our customers and our users to reach out with, potential asks or things you'd want to see in the product that would make it even more helpful.
And Ralph, what is the best way to reach out to you?
Great question. Either ralph.dweck@verus.com is my email, first.lastname @verus.com. That's certainly one way. Actuarialhub@verus.com is another mailbox that I monitor personally. And you should be able to see that. If you go to core.verus.com, you should get prompted with a contact box. So, the many different ways it'll all get to me. But yeah, again, core.verus.com. I can't say the URL enough. I think you'll find a lot of useful stuff there. And by the way, way beyond all the stuff I discussed here, tons of features and line of business hubs that we have, similar to how we have an actuarial hub curating actuarial information. We have line of business centric pages with all the relevant information to a particular line of business. So if you care very specifically about personal auto, all the relevant things that we've done or said about personal auto, you'll probably find them on that personal auto hub. There's an emerging issues hub if you're familiar with the way that we track emerging issues in the market, especially from like a coverage perspective, PFAS or electric vehicle battery fires and everything in between. We have a whole hub dedicated to emerging issues. So core.verus.com, a great place to go for all sorts of new content that may not have existed even a year ago.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. And that actually, I think, brings us to the end of today's presentation. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us, and I hope it was valuable to you. A big special thanks to Verisk for their support and for Ralph for his time and insights. If you missed any part of this presentation, this webcast will be archived at propertycasualty360.com/webcast. So you can view it again or refer it to someone else. You can also explore other upcoming and on-demand presentations while you're there. Have a great afternoon, everyone.